Hi, everyone. I hope that you are having a good weekend. The purpose of this video and lecture is to discuss chapter 2 from the Michael Sandel book Justice. This chapter is on utilitarianism. This is, again, chapter 2, beginning on page 31, and it goes over to page 57. Now, the reason that this chapter is now the next chapter after chapter 1 is because if you recall, in the first chapter, Sandel describes the project of his book. He says that there are going to be three approaches to justice. One approach is thinking about justice through the lens of virtue and vice, and sort of asking what virtues or vices should society be promoting, for lack of a better, there's more to it than that, but at the moment, that's the easiest way to think about it. There's liberty-based approaches, which focuses on the freedom and autonomy of individuals. And that will be especially true in the context of economics, where we don't want to be infringing on the free market, where individuals should be free to engage in economic transactions voluntarily, and the government shouldn't be involved in those. And so liberty and autonomy are particularly important when it comes to economic justice. And then the final approach that he mentions is welfare based approaches. And welfare based approaches can be thought of in terms of utilitarianism, because that's precisely what utilitarianism asks. Now, utilitarianism doesn't always describe it in terms of welfare, but welfare is uh, a way of thinking about the overall well being of a community or the overall well being of a group of people. That's what welfare is. It's a measurement or an estimation of the overall group satisfaction, the overall group welfare, as opposed to the individual. And that's what utilitarianism is about. And so in this chapter, he's going into more detail about that approach to justice. And he will also then present a chapter about liberty based approaches to justice. And then later in the book, he will present um, more details about the virtue based approach to justice. So that's what's going on in the book. What I want to do, I want to look at the notes. I have these notes for you on Canvas, but I want to just take a step back before we um, so utilitarianism is one of Sandel's approaches to questions of justice. What will benefit the overall welfare of a community? And so utilitarianism can be thought of as a specific political philosophy itself, in terms of an approach to questions about what the state or the government ought to do in a given situation. Right. Um, so utilitarianism can be a political philosophy in terms of an approach to questions about what the state or the government ought to do in a given situation. And utilitarianism is going to recommend the course of action that benefits the most people and harms the least amount of people. It's it has as its primary focus the overall well-being of society or a community. That's Sandel is thinking about justice. Sandel is thinking about utilitarianism as an approach to questions of justice in the context of political philosophy, which is, of course, our focus in this course. But utilitarianism is more well known. Utilitarianism is more well known as an ethical theory, meaning an approach to questions, to basic questions of right and wrong. And this may be where a lot of you have heard of it before, as an ethical theory. The first chapter describes the trolley problem. And the most common response to the trolley problem is that you ought to kill one person in order to save five people. There was also the Afghanistan goat herder situation in the first chapter, which was more of a real life trolley problem. And again, the approach that would say kill one to save five, that's a utilitarianism approach. That is a utilitarian approach, meaning a focus on consequences for the greatest good for the greatest number. That is the most well-known phrase associated with utilitarianism. That when you're deciding what to do, what course of action to choose in a given situation at an individual level, what utilitarianism says is you should choose that action which produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people, greatest amount of happiness. Right? The word within utilitarianism, utility equals happiness slash pleasure. So when they say the greatest amount of good, they're saying the greatest amount of happiness, the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. That's the action that we should choose. Now, of course, that's not always going to be easy to figure out. In the trolley problem, it's pretty straightforward. It's matters of life and death, and so it's pretty easy to calculate the most pleasure there because you're literally talking about one person dying versus four people living. And so that's a very, very obvious and straightforward approach. But what he's giving you in this chapter are two of the most well known proponents from the history of philosophy of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Now, so again, just to recap, utilitarianism is two things in the context of this book. It's an ethical theory, meaning it's an approach to basic questions of right and wrong in terms of individual decision making every day. But in the context of the justice project that Sandel has in mind, justice is a political concept, not just an ethical concept, but a political concept. And Sandel is offering utilitarianism not only as an ethical theory, but also as a political philosophy, as an approach to questions about the overall well-being of a community or society in terms of decisions that governments are making or that states are making, whether that be policies or laws or regulations. That would be at the political level. At the individual level, it's an ethical theory. At the political level, it is a political philosophy that is going to help us figure out questions of justice. So that's an important distinction to make. Now, he begins chapter 2 very provocatively with another real world trolley problem scenario where there are four boys or four young men shipwrecked. And it's a pretty gruesome example, but there are four sailors stranded on a lifeboat in the South Atlantic with only 2 cans of turnips and no water. After 19 days, the cabin boy, Richard Parker, falls ill, right? So the youngest boy becomes ill. Dudley and Stevens decide to kill him and they eat him in order to survive. So this is a real life trolley problem, basically. Four men on a boat, stranded. They're out of food, they're out of water. They decide to kill the youngest boy so that the three of them can survive. So that's a real life trolley problem. Three lives are saved, one life is lost. He was an orphan. He was the youngest. And so the calculation was that these three men had families and dependents. So again, all of that is taken into consideration. But these three lives with all of their families and all of their dependents in this, crazy scenario, their lives were determined to be more important than the one life, the young boy, who was going to die anyways. And so the ethical question is utilitarianism would seem to recommend in this case, just like the trolley problem, utilitarianism would seem to say, yes, eat. Again, as callous as it sounds, to kill the young boy and then feed on him to survive. Of course, there were legal consequences, and once they return, they were tried and convicted. So legally, they were held guilty of murder. Um, but ethically, again, that's the question. Ethically, what was the right thing to do? Um, because presumably, if they hadn't killed him, eventually all of them would have died. So again, it's a real life trolley scenario. There's not really another option. All of them would have died if they hadn't done that. So legally, though, of course, they were tried and convicted. And so he introduces this very, very gruesome, provocative example to just show you the kinds of calculations that utilitarianism makes. And of course, one of the things that should kind of jump out at you is the idea that it's very easy within utilitarianism. It's very easy within utilitarianism. I'll just stay on this document. The point is that within Tarian calculations, the individual can be subsumed under the group, can be subsumed or exploited. And this could be individuals or the individual for the sake of the group. In this case, the youngest boy, his life was sacrificed for the greater group. And so one of the most pressing concerns with the utilitarianism approach is the status. In other words, what is the status of individual rights? What is the status of individual rights within utilitarianism? Because it seems like in this context, utilitarianism can tell us that as long as it benefits as long as the greatest number benefits and there's the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number, then there's no problem. And if an individual has to be sacrificed for the greater good, so be it. That's what utilitarianism recommends. So that's just something to think about. That in this chapter. That's one of the big. That's this is probably in terms of utilitarianism the most concerning objection to utilitarianism as both an ethical theory and as a political philosophy. Because if you think about it as a political philosophy, then we get into discussions of majority/minority. And there you can imagine things like minority rights. And somebody might say, well, that's just a small group of people. And ultimately, there are more, whatever you want to say, if you want to make it about race, if you want to make it about gender, if you want to make it about sexual orientation, if you want to make it about economic status, whatever you want to say, anytime we get into discussions of minority rights, we could potentially see a situation with a utilitarian approach that says we are willing to sacrifice or even violate minority rights so that the majority of society can benefit. That's just something to think about. So at the ethical level, you've got sacrificing somebody for the greater good. At the sort of societal level or the political level, you're getting into discussions of majorities and minorities and whether or not we might violate minority rights for the sake of the greater good of society. That's just, again, just something to think about as it relates to utilitarianism. Now, I'm going to come back to this objection in just one moment. I want to jump up to the top here and just talk about, because in this chapter, Sandel discusses two of the most well-known proponents of utilitarianism, who are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So Jeremy Bentham is the first kind of philosopher that is typically associated with utilitarianism as an ethical theory, but again, also as a political philosophy and a social philosophy that can be applied to questions of society and community, not only to questions about individual actions and individual choices. These theories can function in both ways. But Bentham's, at the core of Bentham's, um, you know, thinking about utilitarianism is a simple recognition that human beings dislike pain and like pleasure. And he says there cannot be a more obvious, um, there can't be a more obvious fact about human beings, human psychology, than the fact that we move towards the things that we like and we move away from the things that we dislike. Right. So we don't want to experience pain and we want to experience pleasure. Or if there's no pleasure available, we want to experience as little pain as possible. And so that is the context in which Sandel, that is Bentham's insight. And he thinks based upon that insight about human nature that we dislike pleasure or that we dislike pain and we enjoy pleasure, we can, from that fact, derive an ethical theory that says when we are making decisions that affect other people, not only ourselves, but that affect others, because because all human beings like pleasure and they all dislike pain, we can form an ethical theory that basically says we should choose that set of actions that gives the most people pleasure and gives the least amount of people pain, right? And so that is kind of in a nutshell where utilitarianism comes from. It comes from this basic observation about human nature, about human psychology, and we can derive an ethical theory from that. And Bentham is all about pleasure, right? He wants to say that we can basically say that whatever action produces the most pleasure for the most people, that's the action we should choose. The question is whether that has some troubling implications, right? If if pleasure is it, right? If that's pleasure, pleasure for equals happiness, right? Pleasure equals happiness. You might ask, isn't there more to life than pleasure? Right? Aren't there more considerations? And this is a legitimate question to ask because just like the objection about individual rights, another objection is the attempt to, quantify pleasure, because that's essentially what utilitarianism is asking us to do. It's saying that utilitarianism suggests that to figure out what the right thing to do is in a given situation, we need to be able to quantify pleasure. Because if we're going to say the greatest good for the greatest number, well, how are we going to figure that out? We're going to need to, again, in the case of lives, when you're talking about the boys on the ship or the trolley problem, you're just talking about life and death. And so you're just counting lives, which there's not very many situations where other than these sort of extreme philosophical thought experiments, that's not always going to be that obvious. And so the question is, can we come up with a way to quantify pleasure? Because it seems like it would be complicated to quantify pleasure because, of course, you know, everybody experiences pleasure differently. Everybody experiences, some people, um, I don't know, if I read philosophy, I may experience pleasure very intensely from reading philosophy. But if you read philosophy, then you're not going to experience the same kind of pleasure. We're all going to get pleasure from different things. So how are we going to come up with one scale? This is the question. How are we going to come up with one scale to measure pleasure, for lack, to measure pleasure, right? Or to, let's just say, to quantify pleasure? Because that's what we're going to need to do. If we're going to say the greatest good for the greatest number, then we need to figure out how we're calculating the greatest good. And of course, one way that that gets carried out often, you may have heard of this, but governments and businesses often use a tool called cost benefit analysis. And that is a form of utilitarianism, cost benefit analysis. Because literally, what are you saying with cost benefit analysis? Let's say that a business is trying to make a decision to implement some kind of new training program that's going to cost a certain amount of money. And what the business has to ask themselves is the money that we're going to spend on this new software, this new training program, are we going to see more benefits in the form of money saved potentially from the money that we have to spend on the software? And if we're going to save more money in the long run than the money associated with buying the software, then we should buy the software because the benefits outweigh the costs. So governments and businesses all the time are having to use this kind of analysis, which is cost benefit, which is a utilitarian approach. And here it seems like we just said above, we need a single scale to measure or quantify pleasure and happiness. It seems like here we're saying it's money. That's going to be, I think, um, the most obvious way to quantify happiness and to quantify pleasure is to use dollars, to literally put dollar amounts on people's happiness, on people's pleasure, on people's pain. And that is often what is done, right? And of course, this is concerning because I think as you hear that, you might think, well, I mean, one of the concerns with an overly, I suppose, capitalistic approach is that you focus on, one expression, for example, is that companies often put profits over people. And so right now, for example, something I'm thinking about are all these data centers that are popping up. I don't know if there's any in Nevada, though I'm sure there are. But something that is in the news right now with this rapid expansion of artificial intelligence to support all of this technology, they're having to, build these giant data centers that require lots of water and lots of electricity. And there you can see how, at least what I've seen anecdotally, is that a lot of these local towns don't want these data centers in their communities because it's going to jack up the cost of electricity. It's going to produce, I don't know, pollution potentially. And they don't want it. Now, from the perspective of the companies like Google and OpenAI, which runs ChatGPT, there's another company out there called Anthropic, which owns one of the chatbots called Claude. all of these companies, from their perspective, they're saying, well, there's a lot of money to be made here. And also, we have millions and millions of people that want to use AI, right? So, from that perspective, it seems like they're saying, we're willing to kind of, uh, so this kind of combines two different objections here. On the one hand, they're only thinking about dollars, and the money that they're making, but they're also potentially not considering the local communities and the rights of the local community. So that's just an example that popped into my head that I know lots and lots of people are talking about. And it's only going to continue to be an important issue going forward. Um, so, anyways, those are two big objections. You've got utilitarianism, the ethical theory. It has a solid foundation coming from Jeremy Bentham. Human beings dislike pleasure. I always say dislike pleasure. We like pleasure, we dislike pain. Therefore, we should choose that action which produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people, greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, and the least amount of pain. How do we come up with a single scale? Often that scale is money. But once you start only thinking about money, you might put profits over people, and then you might also violate people's rights in the process. So this is a concern with utilitarianism. And so jumping back down here, um, the book mentions this is what I was just talking about. Having to use dollars as the common currency of value, the problem there is that it might force you to place a value on a human life. If you're going to quantify everything with dollars, then you're going to start quantifying human life. And the example that's given in the book about the EPA valuing the lives of those over 70 at a lower monetary value than younger people, that was something that they used in an environmental cost benefit analysis. Again, you can see how this would work is that if you can put, and you might just reject the premise and say, well, I'm not going to put a dollar amount on human life, but when you're talking about, large government decisions, large financial decisions made by businesses, they end up thinking about this kind of thing, whether they want to or not. If you can put a dollar amount on human life, then which lives will be less valuable? Well, presumably the ones that are less healthy, right? People that are less healthy, uh, people that are older, right? All of that. And you can see how that works, right? People that are less healthy, if you think about the perspective of a health insurance company, it costs more to insure somebody who's sick or somebody who has pre-existing conditions. It costs more to insure them. And so when they're coming up with their models and their healthcare plans about what kinds of things to cover and what not to cover, um, these kinds of decisions are inevitable, at least with the system that we have with our healthcare system, is that less healthy people are their lives are less valuable from the perspective of a financial decision, or people that are older. Their lives are also less valued. But younger, healthier people, their lives are more valuable because they cost less to insure. So again, this is all part of utilitarianism. It's a consequence of having to have this common currency of value and it often ends up being dollars. And then, of course, going back to the other objection, the objection based on individual rights, which is that often we can imagine being willing to violate a group of people's rights if it produces a greater amount of good, right? Um, I was just watching a video about somebody else giving a lecture on this, and off the top of the guy's head, it's a pretty crazy example, but he says, for example, imagine that the government says we're going to enslave all blue-eyed people and they're now going to do all of the labor and all of the work for us so that other people with green eyes and brown eyes have more free time and more leisure time. Now, again, it seems like on the surface, it's like, okay, well, it sucks for the blue-eyed people, but what about all the green-eyed people and all the brown-eyed people? And if I'm leaving out an eye color, I might be. I don't know if I am, but they're now going to have, presumably there's going to be more brown-eyed people and green-eyed people combined than blue-eyed people, and so we enslave the blue-eyed people, put them to work, make them do all the labor, make them do all the stuff we don't want to do, so that we can have more leisure time. The greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. Now, again, we most of us would think that that's crazy. Enslaving anybody violates their rights, right? And that is where most people would object to utilitarianism. But I remember asking you all in the opening discussion post, often, sometimes the government presents debates in terms of liberty versus security, meaning that are you willing to give up some of your liberties or some of your rights, let's say the right to privacy, in order to be made safer, often in times of war, in times of when the country gets attacked after 9/11. One of the most famous pieces of infamous, I should say, pieces of legislation was the Patriot Act after 9/11, and where we were saying that we were willing to sacrifice some of our right to privacy because we were going to be kept safer as a result. That's a kind of utilitarian thinking, which is that our individual rights matter less than the collective security of all of us. That is a utilitarian way of thinking. And, that's just another way to think about maybe a problem or an objection with utilitarianism. Um, so just something to think about. So I've kind of covered, by this point, I've covered Jeremy Bentham. I've given you the basic background on utilitarianism. I've talked about some problems in terms of individual rights, in terms of common currency of value, in terms of quantifying human lives in terms of dollars. One last thing I want to talk about is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill make attempts to improve utilitarianism because it seems like, based on what we've been describing so far, it sounds pretty callous in terms of its regard for the individual. And John Stuart Mill knew Jeremy Bentham, and he wanted to say that we can make a distinction between higher and lower pleasure so that we're not, for example, placing dollar values on human life to make more money. Right? Because John Stuart Mill would say that there are higher and lower pleasures, and this is a controversial distinction that he makes. And in the book, Sandel looks at several examples. But what Mill is saying is that human beings have reason. And as a result, we enjoy intellectual or higher pleasures that appeal to our reason. We also have lower faculties like desire that need appealed to, but we should not only satisfy those all the time. Human beings have reason, we have intellect, and therefore we should be pursuing intellectual pleasures it's fine to pursue sex, alcohol, um, watching TV, playing. None of this is bad, right? None of this is bad. But as humans, we ought to be also cultivating our intellect. And so it's not right to say that there's just pleasure and that's it. There's also higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And if you extend this out to society, then we might be saying that the decisions we're making as a society about the laws and the policies that we're making as a society, they should reflect this distinction between higher and lower pleasures. We shouldn't be only promoting activities as a society that are the most base pleasures. And one example that pops into my head right now is gambling. And of course, I live in Las Vegas, and so this is big here. But I just think about these betting sites like Kalshi. You can look if you've never heard of Kalshi, look it up. Um, but these prediction markets, where now it seems as though as a society, we are promoting betting on everything. Again, not just sports betting, which was the traditional domain of betting, that still exists and that's only getting more. Um, but we have all these prediction markets where we're betting on everything. We're betting on who the next pope is going to be, and we're wanting to make money off who the next pope is going to be. We're betting on who the next president is going to be, and we're predicting that. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? If people want to make some money betting in their free time, fine. But it just kind of strikes me that there's this proliferation of betting and on everything and trying to make money off everything, not just sports, which, sports was kind of this domain where betting was made sense. But now everything, we're betting on everything. And I just wonder, as a society, it seems like Mill would say that is not the kind of activity that would be appealing to our higher faculties, because we're just trying to make money by betting on potentially very, very serious things. So that's just something that's an example that I thought of as we live in 2026. So that's just something to think about. Mill makes this distinction. He wants to improve Bentham's utilitarianism by saying there are higher and lower pleasures. And then if you extend that out to society, he's going to say that the kinds of activities we should be promoting as a society, the kind of laws and policies, they should be reflecting a kind of higher pleasure, so to speak. Not only, it's not that lower pleasures don't have their place, but collectively, um, are we comfortable with promoting only base lower pleasures that appeal to the lowest common denominator of uh, human existence, I guess. And I think this example comes out the strongest in something like the example that's given in the book about feeding Christians to the lions, where, in other words, we're gathering in these stadiums to watch human beings be fed to lions. Now, it's pleasing a lot of people. Lots of people are cheering and, they love it. Now, maybe not everybody would. You might think it's cruel. You might think it's crazy, but it was done. And there, it seems like if we're just dealing with pleasure as such, it's just there's no higher and lower pleasure. That's just pleasure. And if a bunch of people want to watch a spectacle like that, then who's to stop them? But Mill might ask us, is that an activity that we want to be promoting as a society in terms of higher and lower pleasures? And it seems like the answer would be no. We want to, you know, we want to say that feeding human beings to animals for other people to watch is not something that appeals to higher pleasures. Now, I think the one question you might want to ask Mill at this point, right, is by appealing to something like higher pleasures, are you still only using utilitarian considerations? One of the criticisms that's mentioned in the book, and I think this is a fair thing to ask, is when John Stuart Mill starts making this claim about higher pleasures as a consideration, is that utilitarianism nature? Is that thinking about the greatest good for the greatest number, or um, is there some other factor that's being smuggled in, some ideal version of the human being that allows us to appeal to our intellectual pleasure? And he's saying that's what we should be striving for as a society. But then you're no longer only saying the greatest good for the greatest number. You have this other factor that you're considering. And so it may no longer be only utilitarian. So that's just something to consider. And I think towards the end of the chapter, um, Sandel points to this. He says, Mill strays from the, so I'm on page 55, Mill strays from the utilitarian premise. No longer are de facto desires the sole basis for judging what is noble and base. Now the standard derives from an ideal of human dignity independent of wants and desires. The higher pleasures are not higher because we prefer them. We prefer them because we recognize them as higher. So that's on from 55 on to 56, which is, I think this is the objection that we might make to John Stuart Mill. So even though he thinks he's improving Bentham, this is something to consider. So, anyways, that's all I have. Um, I wanted to talk about utilitarianism as an ethical theory, but also think about it as a political theory, because governments are often making decisions about the greatest good or the welfare or the welfare of the group, the welfare of society. And then there's also discussions of majority and minority. And this all implicates utilitarianism because that's what it's about. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys for the next lecture.